Rosenberg.
And it's Friday night, and on Friday night one can, on this program, very often
By Chicagoland Cadillac dealers. Here is your host and moderator, Milton Rosenberg.
And it's Friday night, and on Friday night one can, on this program, very often sit back, relax, and sort of do a slapdash, bum-around kind of program without too much clarity as to how it's all going to work out. Just as I've been saying lately, a good schmooze with people who've got something interesting to talk about. And we certainly have two of those with us tonight. Douglas Adams is the hitchhiker who's been hitchhiking around the galaxy. That is, the man who invented Arthur Dent, Ford Prefect, and those 1,000 other incredible creatures and those 1,000 other incredible worlds. And the fourth book in the Hitchhiker trilogy, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, has just appeared and is published by Harmony Books, whoever they may be.
It's an imprint of Crown.
An imprint of Crown Books. Alan Gross is well known to all theater goers and, for that matter, to serious radio listeners in Chicago. A very active playwright. You'll recognize the names of many of these plays. They've all been performed in Chicago and elsewhere. Lunching, The Phone Room, The Man in 605, Morning Call, the La Brea Tar Pits. Much of his stuff has also been done on national radio via the program Earplay. And we're going to hear a little bit of one of the plays, The Man in 605, as we will also hear some Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio material. And both of those are in the general realm of comedic art, and it's comedic art we're looking at tonight. Mostly, I thought, because I really just wanted to do this, and you two being here is my excuse for indulging myself, I wanted to look at ensemble comedy, people playing together. Though I've got one or two monologues in here, but it's mostly ensemble. And I don't know why I feel that we should begin with a goon show, but it seems to me that much of the absurdity, at least in contemporary British comedy, takes its source from the Goon Show. Am I right, Doug?
Well, yes and no, indirectly in my case.
Most Americans don't know what the Goon Show is. You've got to tell them that as well.
Oh, right.
Was,
well, the Goon Show actually owes its origins to the Army. Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, and Harry Seacombe, and I suppose Peter Sellers will be the only name out of that bunch well known to Americans, did this extraordinary, bizarre radio show.
Surreal would be one.
Very, very surreal, very peculiar. And it would be, what, about 25 years ago, I think? And they were together in the Army, and they came out and did it.
Was on BBC, I presume.
That's on BBC Radio, yeah.
But it's since been played and replayed on American university stations and other such places for years.
But the curious thing is, I mean, that was... I would say that the Goon Show very, very strongly influenced the people who very strongly influenced me. But in fact, the Goon Show itself did not impact on me.
Who were those people who were influenced by it and in turn influenced you?
Well, I suppose the Pythons are an obvious example.
And you are the next half generation after the Pythons.
That's right. They're all 10 years older than me.
And you've worked for some of the Pythons, haven't you?
Well, I worked with Graham Chapman for about a year, mostly on projects which failed to see the light of day.
Well, we've got some Monty Python stuff coming up shortly thereafter, but I want to start with the Goon Show. Are you a Goon Show fan, Alan?
I've heard it. I like it very much. I'm not an aficionado of it. It's interesting. I think it's funny.
I think it's superb high nonsense. And this one, titled The Dreaded Batter Pudding, is one of my favorites, and we'll just plunge right into the pudding itself. Utter madness. And Alan, don't you think that's utterly English madness?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm wondering what a batter pudding is exactly.
Well, I'm sure Doug can tell us.
I can't tell. It's a pudding made of batter. It's something.
It's a dough pudding of some kind.
Yes, it's you get a tray. You fill it full of batter, you shove it in the oven, and a little while later it goes brown and puffs up, and you eat it with roast beef. It's sometimes called Yorkshire pudding.
Oh, Yorkshire pudding.
Yeah, that's so much easier. But there's something quite regressed and infantile, delightfully.
Well, you know what I was thinking of?
Really.
It's sweet comedy.
It's very sweet,
very naive, very sweet, and it doesn't attack. It doesn't really spoof anything except the locals. which is an interesting.
There's also an awful lot of play with language. Minnie, the famous poker player, give her a poker and she can play any tune. It's very silly, it's very obvious, but all the same, it's a play with the double meanings of language or with syntactic conversions, which enable you to get all sorts of odd meanings out of otherwise pedestrian things.
It's interesting what Alan says about it being very sweet humor that doesn't doesn't attack anybody or anything, because that's actually, it's terribly difficult to do that nowadays. I mean, you wouldn't imagine somebody sitting down and doing a show like the Goon Show nowadays. I'm reminded of Tom Lehrer, who was interviewed, I remember hearing him about 3 or 4 years ago, and he was asked why he had been silent for the last 10 years. And he said, well, when he was writing his songs in the 60s, there was a strong consensus viewpoint about what was the right way of looking at things, and there seemed to be very little doubt about what was right and what was wrong and who were the goodies and who were the baddies. And he says it's now very, very difficult to know. Everything is far, far more complex and far, far more worrying and deeply disturbing than ever it had been when he was at work, and he just couldn't find anything funny anymore. He thought, that our situation was far too desperate and everything was far too bad to be able to make jokes about it.
Werner von Braun, his song about Werner von Braun with regard to the making of the V-2 rockets. I send up the rockets, but where they come down, that's not my department, says Werner von Braun. So, don't drink the water, don't breathe the air. That is ecological song.
Oh yes.
When you go to the city,
I hadn't heard them for years, but
I wonder if Werner von Braun was alive today and Tom Lehrer wrote the song today, whether he would hear from a cadre of Werner's lawyers. Which is something I'd like to eventually get on. It's hard to be funny
at it now.
Today.
It's hard now because they're gonna sue you for libel. You mean?
Well, I'm surprised if we did this one. I think that the Biddies Union would be on us, and you'd at least get a call.
The Grey Panthers, they're called.
Yeah, sure they would, and say we have our dignity. And it's hard to be funny.
You can hardly do accent humor and ethnic humor.
That's right. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons I think that English humor is better than Yankee humor is because of the class distinctions that they're still pounding on one another for. They haven't gotten rid of that, and one class beats on the next class. Whereas here we live in a classless state. No one can beat on anyone.
What classes are involved? We're going to go to Monty Python, who are somehow directly or lineally descended, it seems to me, from the Goon Show. Yet it's a different sort of humor. There's more class consciousness in it. They are putting down the working class and they're putting down the toffs. These are university wits down. Are they mostly from Cambridge or Oxford, the Python group?
John and Graham and Eric were Cambridge. Mike and Terry Jones were Oxford, and Terry Gilliam was UCLA.
Yes, of course, he's the American.
Yeah.
You might want to explain the difference in personality between Oxford and Cambridge, or at least the way
I would do if I actually knew for sure what it was. It's very difficult to define.
Here's what I've been told. Tell me if this is wrong. That Oxford is a more relaxed atmosphere in a sunny little plain outside of. It's California-like. It's laid back. Whereas Cambridge is cold and mean and windy and wet and rough, and there's a slightly different hue to the whole
Cambridge,
thing.
in fact, takes intellectualism far more seriously.
I suppose
Oxford is laid back in the sense that it has a more aristocratic attitude. Yeah. It's really rather too much fuss and too much show and too much showing off.
It's the difference between Cambridge is University of Chicago to Oxford's Stanford, USC.
Not a bad comparison.
It's interesting that Cambridge is really where a lot of the footlights at Cambridge is the one that's really identified with English university humour, whereas Oxford, yes, they never really sort of get around to sort of institutionalising themselves.
Beyond the fringe group came from Cambridge.
Half and half.
Mainly, but
no, half and half. Jonathan Miller and Peter Cook were Cambridge, and Dudley Moore and Alan Bennett were Oxford.
I'm eager to plunge into Monty Python and into one of their famous skits, The Cheese Shop.
This is one of my favorite ever Python sketches.
Do you want to say something interpretive about it in advance, or do you want to wait until we've heard it?
No, except it's one of these very improbable sketches, which is just really a sort of one-joke sketch. As I was mentioning that other thing earlier, before we went on the air, but I won't talk about it now because the listeners won't know what I'm talking about. But it is one joke which goes on and on and on, longer than you could possibly imagine.
Superbly acted, wonderfully timed. And in fact, one has to say a word about the beautiful comic acting of these
But
people.
there's also another extraordinary thing in it, without which it probably wouldn't work. But it's very hard to say what it's doing there, which is all the business with the bouzouki.
Yes.
Which there's a bouzouki player playing in the background whilst the sketch goes on. And to begin with, he says, "This is fine, yes, okay." And then as John Cleese gets more and more irate, he suddenly loses his temper quite with the bouzouki player.
There may be 10 people out there who've never seen this on television. Let's give it to them as a gift right now.
I love that sketch.
Yes. Well, how in the world does that work? There are a lot of things going. Yes, it's a one-joke sketch, but there are a lot of other things.
But all the variations on it
somewhere.
are just so beautifully worked
When
out.
was that done?
That's a good 10 years ago, I would bet.
Oh yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Actually, that I think that's their finest record, their Matching Tie and Handkerchief. Do you know the one of my favourite ever things on it, and I don't understand why he never does it on stage, which is the word association monologue on that. Because John Cleese really ought to do that on stage. It's such a wonderful piece. He claims it's impossible to remember it because it's so complicated. I can remember it. Shall I do it for you?
Please, yes.
All right. Okay, it goes like this. I'm going to regret having let myself in for this. This is a John Cleese monologue. Tonight's the night I shall be talking about a flu, the subject of word association football. This is a technique out of living, much used in the practice makes perfect of psychoanalysis, sister and brother, one that has occupied Piper, the majority rule of my attention squad by the right numbers 1, 2, 3, for the last 5 years to the memory. It is quite remarkable, Baker Charlie, how much the miller's son, the so-called word association immigrants, influences the manner from heaven in which we sleek carrying timorous beasties, all Americans speak. The famous explorer. And the really rather surprising partner in crime is that a lot and his wife with the land's feeding time, we may be CDE effectively quite unaware of the fact or fiction section of the Watford Public Library, though we are even doing it is a far, far better thing that I do now then what's going on with Christian Barnard, a famous hearty part of Let Us Now Praise famous mental homes for loonies like me. So on the button, my contention causing all the headaches is that unless we take into account of Monte Cristo and I think King George V, this phenomenon on the other hand, we shall not be able to satisfy fact or fiction section of the Watford Public Library again, only to understand her attention when I'm talking to about human nature, man's psychological makeups, I'm sorry, the wife will believe, and hence the very meaning of life, its selfish bastard, I'll kick him in the Balls Pond Road.
Good Lord.
I made a few errors there, I'm afraid, but it's...
There is, I've long been convinced that something that really has affected all of these fellows is their university life, because they are from Cambridge or from Oxford. Now, let's see, is Cleese a Canterbridgian?
He was at Cambridge. His school. He was at Clifton Sports Academy, as he calls it, near Bristol. He was brought up actually. He had a very strange upbringing. He was brought up in a very, very sort of repressive upper middle class or seeking to be upper middle class background.
But there was a point that I want to press. It is simply this: linguistic philosophy is something they take terribly seriously at Cambridge, more than they do at Oxford, and it has tremendous influence upon the mental life and the intellectual development of all the brighter people at Cambridge, and it's something which affects all the rest of your views of existence for all the rest of your life. Meaning becomes evasive, ephemeral, and meaning itself becomes a bit of a put-on, and therefore one loses respect for the solidity of things and concepts, and from that can flow wonderful surreal comic convention.
Yes, I mean the structures by which you, I suppose, go after meaning in the end become more fascinating than the meaning that they're supposed to.
And that's a road into a kind of comic convention.
Yeah, I guess it probably has. Yes.
As a matter of fact, it's a road that I think you've taken. Which university was yours?
Cambridge.
There you are.
Yes.
But meanwhile, Harold Pinter, who went to neither, does all that stuff in his work. He's got in a Slight Ache, which is one of his shorter plays.
You're directing.
Which I'm directing, so I happen to be familiar with it right now. He's got a long thing in which a guy is asking a man what drink he wants. And I am not bright enough to have it memorized, but he just says, now what are you drinking? Will it be a... And he starts with very simple little drinks. Gin and it, an asti spumante, and he goes into these long, complicated, imported Keller wines, and it takes about a minute, a full minute while he's just... And then he ends with, any preference? After he's done this long word poem of every drink you ever heard of. And it's the same kind of thing. I just think that the English are more attuned to words.
Well, it's partly Pinter characters obviously use the articulate ones, are the ones who use words as a weapon. I mean, the popular conception, I mean, the popular misconception of Pinter years ago was that it was all about people's failure or inability to communicate with each other. In fact, it's about their inability to not communicate, their inability to prevent themselves communicating.
But it's people talking past each other in some
No, that's right. Well, except it's the people who don't have control of words, who continually give themselves away and are terribly open and terribly obvious and terribly vulnerable. Whereas the people who do have control of words, who are articulate, who become completely opaque.
We are about to pause for some commercials, and I note to my distress, but not to my surprise, we're 10 minutes late for those. So I'll have to use more discipline with you fellows from here on, and I will have to discipline myself more. When we return, and as a transition from Britain to America, I've got for you a famous British person whom I will not otherwise define, being interviewed by me, no less, and it turns out to be a rather unusual comic dialogue. And more than that I shall not say, and it's not on the list you've got in front of you, and we'll be right back after these words. Thank you, Floyd Brown. And tonight, a sort of loose romp through British and American comedy with Douglas Adams, author of the Hitchhiker trilogy, the fourth item of which, just newly published, is So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. And Alan Gross, local playwright, director, and freelance journalist, who has done so many fine plays. We're going to hear an excerpt from one of them in just a while. But first, I promised you an excerpt which I thought to be rather charming. Regular listeners to this program have heard it perhaps once or twice before, but neither of you have, I think. And this is an interview that was done on this very program with a man who is not who or he appears to be as the dialogue begins. But listen to it, and when we're all done, tell me what you think of it as comic improvisation, because this is purely worked up for the moment. Senator, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us tonight. And we are, of course, tape recorded, and these comments will be heard a week or two after we record them. All the same, what is fresh in immediate memory and response at the moment is the Lance affair and Mr. Lance's resignation just yesterday. Where did you stand on it before he actually made that decision?
Well, of course, I'm a personal friend of Bert's, and this sort of thing is very hurtful to both myself and Mrs. Wertenbaker, and I don't think it's really justified. I don't think we went right at the end of the road there. I think we could have gone further. I think that Bert handled himself with great courtesy, and I want to make it perfectly clear where I stand on this matter. I do not bank with him myself, but I'd be quite happy to.
I perhaps should not get into what I'm about to raise, and I apologize in advance, but...
so long as it's meaningful.
Well, it was meaningful to many of the people back in your home state who, about a year after you went to the Senate, began to read in the leading newspaper published from the state capital that the Wertenbaker Pillow Company had under, and that I believe was your major enterprise before you were elevated to your present significant position, that the Wertenbaker Pillow Company and some of the attendant corporations, which are all part of the complex...
Leave them out of it.
Well, we'll stay with the pillows. That your contract with the state to provide pillows for all of the state institutions, the mental hospitals and what have you, seem to be padded, and indeed that is a word particularly appropriate to pillows.
Well, let me say this. It has been stated by better people than myself that understood that there was a degree of enlightened self-interest in my actions there. Now, no one in this country that I know of has ever been against enlightened self-interest.
If enlightened.
Well, I don't care for self-interest unless it is enlightened. I like to know where I'm going. And government is prone to enlightened self-interest. I think individuals should be. And I tell you that, well, since we're on the air, I'll tell you that My Pillows, Our Pillows, it is a public company. I happen to be a majority, at least I'm no longer because I'm in the Senate. My wife is a majority shareholder, and she hopes to go in the Senate when I am no longer here to defend the pillow company. We try and keep the pillows in the family. And this is just not idle pillow talk.
Senator, lots of those who admire you, and for that matter, some who don't admire you but take note of your significant presence in Washington, see you as a simple man of the people, in a sense, from rural America, and that, I must confess, is the way I have perceived you at a distance over the television tube and so on. Thus, I was all the more surprised to see you walk into this building just a few minutes ago with a man of a very different quality, of a very different public image, the brilliant English actor Peter Ustinov, who seems to me, if anything, a touch on the over-sophisticated side as compared to what you must have encountered back in Zenith City when you were running the Wertenbaker Pillow Company. Yet you and Ustinov seem to be friends of a sort.
We've known each other. We have nothing in common, I have to say that. He's a likable enough guy. I don't understand all he talks about, and I don't think he knows anything about America, the kind of America I stand up for, and I regard as number one in this world. I came up here, and I walked up the stairs because I couldn't get my caddy in through the door, and that is the reason I was reduced to walking, and he takes up a lot of room. There wasn't much place for me in the car there. It's lucky we got here together.
Peter Ustinov.
I thought it was Peter Ustinov.
Of course. Pure improvisation.
Oh,
all I said to him was, be an American senator. And
Yes.
we had no script.
Yeah.
And I just threw him the lines, and that's what he did.
Oh, he's extraordinarily brilliant. Interestingly, I was sitting next to him, well, nearly next to him on a plane recently, going across the Atlantic, and it was one of these things I always swear I won't do, which is going on the red eye, going eastward, which is absolute killer, and you don't manage to sleep. And I was trying to sleep during the flight, and I couldn't. And I didn't speak to Ustinov at all, but he was just a couple of seats away, and he was obviously not managing to sleep and so on. And you get to Heathrow, and you struggle in through the early morning traffic into London, feeling like absolute death. And I turned on the radio, and it's the radio channel I turned on. It said, our special guest at 11 o'clock this morning is Mr. Peter Ustinov.
Oh, my.
And I thought, how on earth is he at 11 o'clock this morning going to sound coherent, intelligent, even human? I don't know how he is going to manage to do it. So I got home, struggled home, and was sort of fooling around at home trying to find anything to do. Turned on the radio at 11 o'clock, and I wondered, how is he going to sound intelligent, coherent, and even human? And the answer was that he didn't. And if I had tuned in not having been next to him on the plane, I would have thought this guy is drunk or senile or whatever. And it was just an absolute sort of killing thing to do. But so it was terribly disappointing that you expected him to be sort of, because he's such an extraordinary man, to sort of rise above it and be superhuman, but he's human.
What I have been looking for is a bridge from the British to the American. And I have found it in an American imitation of Shakespeare, indeed an American imitation of Hamlet. The Brits do wonderful send-ups, as they call it, on Shakespeare. Indeed, we mentioned earlier Jonathan Miller. And in the original album that they turned out, there was a wonderful imitation of Shakespearean historical drama.
Oh, that's a very famous sketch, yes.
And Miller is in the middle of it. But here is the Firesign Theater, a group of Americans. I don't think there's a Brit in the lot. But they are doing a take-off or send-up, as the British would say, of Hamlet, of all things. And it works wonderfully well. And it does indeed remind me of Olivier's Hamlet film. There are elements in it which I think beautifully capture the very mise-en-scène of the battlements of Elsinore as represented in that film. This is the appearance of the ghost and Hamlet pursuing the ghost. However, this one is called, the names are changed. It's King Bernardo, and they are at Castle Flem, and that's the name of this bit. Let's hear it. I am a sucker for parody, and I think
Very
it's a
good one.
superb
Very
parody,
good,
isn't
yes. Absolutely. Yes, I'm not that familiar with the Firesign Theatre, which I ought to be, because I hear
Didn't
so
they
much
once have a
about it.
Chicago identity, Alan? Do you know anything about their
No,
history?
they're Los Angelinos. And they did these sorts of things for a while, and then they split up, and some of them went into commercial acting, and it sort of came and went. There was a lot of drug humor in the Firesign Theatre. Absolutely none in that.
Not in this piece, no.
Not one reference. But it was kind of druggy absurdity. But then again, they were in the 60s, and that was a big to-do at that time.
That's so textually rich. You could really sit there and do a deconstructionist analysis of it, I suppose.
Talking of parody humor, one of the funniest things I've seen recently is a book done by Michael Frith and Henry Beard. It's a Muppet book. Michael Frith is one of the designers, one of the main designers on the Muppets, and Henry Beard has regularly done Miss Piggy stuff. And it's a book called The Kermitage, or Kermitage, or however you like to pronounce it, and it purports to be a collection of Miss Piggy's paintings from the Kermitage, and they're all very well.
Hermitage in Leningrad.
That's right, yes. And they're all very well-known paintings, like Venus Rising from on the half shell, and Whistler's Mother, and so on and so forth, but all reconstructed with Muppets, and they've been so incredibly beautifully done. I mean, they went to no. They spared no effort to get them perfectly done. And then there's the most wonderful commentary written by Henry Beard and Miss Piggy's style on what she thinks of the paintings. And what is so delightful about the book is that as parody, it is so incredibly accurate. And also wildly funny. So I'm actually plugging this book. I mean, that's nothing to do with me, but I would like to bring it to people's attention because it's in the bookshops now, and it's one of the funniest things I've seen.
Sort of raises the large question, the heavy question, the question you will both avoid as soon as I put it, but I'll give you 3 minutes to think about an answer because we're about to pause and do some of our own funny stuff, the commercials. That question is, the question raised since Aristotle or earlier, what is humor? Or what is funny?
Oh, boy.
And how does it work? And what unifies all the different kinds of humor? Is there some central mechanism or event or trick of mind which is the key to funniness in human performance?
You know, comedians answering that question have ruined more of their own careers than drunkenness or cancer.
Well, you may well refuse to answer the question, but at any rate, we pause first for these words.
Miller Inventory, extension 720. Once again, Milt Rosenberg.
Thank you, Floyd Brown. And we return to Alan Gross and Douglas Adams. And I fully expect to be put down for asking that question, but I will ask it again, and I will even underline.
Timing, it's timing, Milt.
Yes, you mistimed that one.
Which is, yes, that's a wonderful joke in itself. You want to tell the whole? No, we can't tell the whole
It doesn't
story.
work. It's just, that's the best I could do. That's the best I could do.
What's the secret of your
timing?
But
No,
remember that this is all sorts of people have essayed this. I mentioned Aristotle and so many others down through the ages.
And
They've
his
written
lovely wife
treatises
Jackie.
on the nature
I loved
of
them,
humor.
and I loved him. I loved his work, and what a man.
All right, you're being funnier. You're trying to be with regard to Aristotle.
no, it is very,
Now,
very
the joke-
dangerous, actually,
well, what
to
did he
try
do?
and talk about what humor is.
All right.
But I have some interesting observations, well, interesting to me, which I really sort of came from school. When I was, I first started studying Shakespeare at school, and we first did the histories and the tragedies, and I always had my eye out for knowing, we were going to be doing the comedies, and, I thought that's going to be fun because, I like a few jokes. And so we got to the comedies, and like a lot of other people, at that age, I was a little bemused. Where are the jokes? It didn't seem to be sort of particularly funny or anything.
No yucks.
No, yeah. And so it was explained to me patiently by the teacher that humor is very much a sort of local thing in time, and that what the Elizabethans found funny would be different from what we would find funny. And I was terribly disappointed by this, because what made me laugh had always been terribly important to me, and it seemed somehow wrong that we should be moved by the same things, excited by the same things, awed by the same things, frightened by the same things, and so on, and not laugh at the same things. It seemed as if humor was some sort of lesser, more trivial emotion. I was very disappointed by that.
You don't have to go. Go ahead.
Then subsequently came across Chaucer. Now, after the initial sort of slight difficulty with the language, which evaporates very quickly when you get used to it, I suddenly found that here was a very, very funny man.
You find The Wife of Bath funny?
Oh yes, I mean the Canterbury Tales is wonderfully funny, and it's observational humour. Now Shakespeare, for all that he may be, the greatest writer in the English language, actually cannot do jokes. Now, where he does funny bits. There's a classic funny bit in Macbeth, which is one of the most brilliantly constructed.
The Porter scene, of course.
It's brilliantly constructed. Duncan has been murdered,
right,
and Macbeth's in a terrible state because he's done it, and he didn't really want to do it, but he's been made to do it by him, and Lady Macbeth's off, and Macduff's there banging on the castle walls and a sort of storm and everything. I mean, it is the most awful moment of tension. As the banging goes on, this porter comes out and does...
He's drunk to begin with.
Yeah, he's drunk, and he does this stand-up comedy act. But it's all stuff about sort of French farmers, or well, in fact, French farmers have continued for centuries to be a source of amusement to the English.
They'll get a group together and sue you guys.
But it's rather, it's rather like Johnny Carson's monologue at the beginning of The Tonight Show, that 2 weeks later you wouldn't know what he was talking about. It's just topical humour, and he wrote that, although the construction of that scene is timeless, the actual jokes he writes are the jokes of that week. And they don't actually last. I don't suppose they lasted a month, let alone 4 centuries. And he could only do sort of topical jokes, or he could do punning jokes. I mean, for instance, there's Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. And the joke there is that he gets his words wrong the whole time. He commits malapropisms. But why do we call them malapropisms when Sheridan wrote Mrs. Malaprop,
right,
2 centuries later, and he did it better than Shakespeare, which is why we call them malapropisms.
How would you like to have been the producer of Shakespeare and have to sit there and say, look, the guy can't do comedy, we can call him, hello, Lou, we'd like you to come in here and punch the guy's stuff up. He's a little, Will, we got a guy coming, he's not going to get any credit, and there is someone in history that punched him up. That's just not mentioned in any of the folios. A guy came, he said, all right, let me hear a couple of things, go through it a little bit. And then he did it, and this is an unknown man, a great unknown writer.
Well, there's a lot of controversy about that. There are those, of course, who are convinced that Shakespeare was an ordinary English actor, and that he just lent his name to the work of Francis Bacon or to the work of Edmund de Vere.
Or Lou.
Or
Remember
possibly
Lou, who came in to punch it up, to give it a couple of lines.
There's also the theory that John Decker, who was a journeyman playwright in Elizabethan times, did some secret collaboration with Shakespeare, so you're closer than
But John Decker could make him laugh, hence the name. He had him laid out on the deck. He was funny, but and he's angry to this minute. He comes to me in the night sometime and says, get it in writing, because there'll be a Shakespeare, he'll take everything away from you.
Well, you two have both, of course, neatly sidestepped my question. What is the mechanism of humor?
All right, funny, this is Mel Brooks. Funny is you falling down. Tragedy is me falling down. So
not enough.
Well,
it's a good Brooks line, but it doesn't capture all varieties of humor.
Well, I'll tell you, there are 2 ways that I see it. One is zigzagging, the absolute unexpected. Just when something's about to happen, boom, something else happens. And the other thing is, the closer you can do those unexpected things to tragedy, the closer you can come, the more on the tightrope you are, the funnier I think things can be.
Don't you think that indirect statement is, if not the key to humor, a very important part of humor? Saying things without saying them directly.
Yes, it can be. I certainly found, I spent, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, I spent 7 months living in Los Angeles, which I hated. I couldn't bear it there. I found myself utterly disoriented. And I was trying to work out why I felt disoriented, apart from the smog and everything. And I realized after a while that there was one important thing missing there, that we in England have as a major national resource and have so much of it that we take it for granted and assume we would find it everywhere, like like oxygen, and it's irony, and they don't have any in Los Angeles. And that's why, I mean, I found there was nothing to laugh at in Los Angeles ever, because everything anybody said was actually for real. That's what they
Alan finds something to laugh about in Los Angeles. He's got a play titled The La Brea Tar Pits, and I think the very concept of the La Brea Tar Pits is very funny.
You know what,
I actually saw them a few years ago for the first time.
The La Brea Tar Pits is about people trying to resurrect their marriage after divorce, trying to see what was wrong with it as they dig up the bones for... I've lived in Los Angeles and worked as a writer too, and I found that they have something beyond any other city I've ever been in, and that is self-hatred. Everyone hates themselves in Los Angeles, and when a guy puts his arm around you and says, hey, you and me, we're just alike, he despises himself, which means by definition, he despises you too. And the thing in him that he wants to kill that's easiest is you. So he'll kill you trying to excise the cancerous thing inside him that he wants out. And it turns out to be you. So it's your friends are the most dangerous people there. So I depend on enemies and muggers when I personally am in Los Angeles.
I like something that a San Franciscan said to me about Los Angeles. He said the thing they really like about Los Angeles and San Francisco is that all the sort of people who like Los Angeles go off and live there.
Well then, another one of those necessary commercial pauses. I am wondering where we go next, and I think next we go to something I've just recently discovered and much enjoy. I know this was an important radio program, and it did in turn beget Saturday Night Live, namely the National Lampoon radio program, and I found a number of cuts on a few of those albums, which are really quite good. And we're going to turn to some of that material and get your reaction to it after we pause for these words.
Yo, Chicago, this is Extension 720. Back now to your host and moderator, Milt Rosenberg.
Gentlemen, we are back on the air. I always love a good conversation where the talk is just as vigorous during the commercials as it is while we're on the air. But back to work. Back to the National Lampoon radio show. And this is rather recent, I think. At least the album dates to... well, to 1975, not all that recent. There is a more recent album done in 1982 by the National Lampoon, though I don't think, Alan, they're still on the air, are they?
No.
So they put together some special albums later on.
I think that one in 1982 may have been pickups of old stuff too. I'm not sure.
Well, here's one called Gold Turkey. I don't think I'll define it any further, except that the two performers are Christopher Guest, whom I don't know, and Bill Murray, whom we all know from his days on Saturday Night Live and his later films. I guess my tastes do really run to parody. I've certainly heard that fellow introducing dramatic things on PBS.
This is WFMT now.
A number of
as
times.
we speak. He's on WFMT as we speak.
That was sort of WFMT
click
voice.
the thing real quick, everybody. Click, click, back to WGN. All right. But he was there. You heard him.
I think that's delightful stuff, and I've only heard it this very night, I must confess. Barbara McElroy, our producer, selected it, and it's the one that, as I listened to the whole batch before we began, broke me up most. How did you like it?
Oh, a lot. Yes, well, it was very funny.
Very nice.
You want one more from the same National Lampoon?
Yeah,
well, it's
yes.
called National Lampoon, but this is from an album done in 1982, and I found this one superb as well. It's called The South Bronx is Burning. The performers... Roger Bumpass and Barry Diamond. I don't know either of them. Do you?
Nope. No.
Well, they're very good. Listen to them.
That's a wonderful performance.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Superb performance.
The Hispanic Defamation League will be here shortly.
You're bothered by that, Alan. Has somebody been on your back?
Oh, often. Sure.
Seriously?
Oh, sure. I don't even want to list the groups. But that is a situation that exists in America. You see, America is a place in which the media pretends that you're okay, no matter who you are. And therefore, you've got your rights, and no one will fool with them. And because of that, everyone is very... England, I think, is a place where it's pretty well agreed that nobody is okay. You're not okay.
Yeah, you can.
Other people don't like you.
And everyone's fair game, it seems.
That's right. Everyone's fair game.
Well, part of the English
I mean, suing people here seems to be a sort of national sport. I mean, in England, it's a sort of last defense
Well, even
really, that you
Israeli
would sue
cabinet
somebody for defamation.
ministers come over here to sue American magazines.
Well, maybe yes.
After all.
But it really is. It's a way of making money. Just see if there's anybody you can find who might possibly you could say you could construe has damaged you in some way. Let's get some money. I mean, it's
some of the great American comic conventions involved an awful lot of humor about ethnic groups and regional groups. For example, Fred Allen's Alley, which was a wonderful
It could not
conception.
be done today.
A Jewish lady, a Downeaster, a Southern blowhard, and what else did we have on
It could
Allen's
not
Alley?
be done today.
Just couldn't be done.
Could not be done
Be
today.
sued by the Anti-Defamation League.
Everybody would be on you. I'm not
By the New
kidding.
England Protective Association. I don't know.
But you will, I'm surprised that you haven't had that. If we were picked up phones, they'd be ringing now. Someone would be angry.
Gee, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I should explain to our audience that we'll take a few phone calls later tonight, but not as many as we usually do during the second hour, because when we've got a lot of cuts to play, we run over the first hour with those. The number still is 591-7200, but there's no point in dialing it now. We won't be getting to the phones, perhaps for another 15 minutes or so. What I do want to get to, after I clear my throat, is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And we've got to say a word about the new book. What exactly, let me see if we can do this as a serious interview in serio-comic form. What was your intention, Douglas Adams, in the composition of this fourth item in the Hitchhiker trilogy?
A condominium.
That's very sweet of you to say so, Alan. No, well, it was
So Long and Thanks for All the Fish is the name of the book, and it's published by Harmony Books, who are,
an imprint of
we're
Crown,
told, an imprint of
Crown
Crown Books.
I was faced with one major frustration after I'd finished the third book, and I'd sworn I would never do another one, which was there was one piece that I really wanted to do, and I'd never managed quite to sort of fit it in. And I was going to be brave about it and say, well, too bad, I'll just have to lose that one. And but then it sort of began to nag at me, and it's the story about God's final message to his creation, which I really wanted to get in, and eventually it wouldn't shut up anymore, so I decided, well, I'd better do it again. And because I really, whenever I say I'm not going to do another Hitchhiker, I have to say it absolutely relentlessly, because the first chink and the contract is there, you see, so I have to do it. And but I really wanted to do the story about God's final message to his creation. There's no other way I could sort of get it into anything else. It had to be in Hitchhiker. And then, so I thought, whilst I'm tackling this, let's sort of deal with some of the other things that I haven't managed to do in Hitchhiker. And one of the major problems about it always was that because I was rash enough in the very first book, right at the beginning, to demolish the Earth in a sort of crazy, reckless writing move, I had destroyed the very framework of reference that I actually would share with the reader.
Curious, I've selected two things from the earlier recorded material from the radio program. I've selected the piece, A Short History of the Earth, in which you demolish the Earth.
Right.
And then I've selected Answer from the Messiah, that is from the Grand Computer, which turns out not to be the ultimate answer, so it is
it's
penultimate,
leading towards that.
leading towards this book,
Yes,
leading towards
right.
God's answer. It was superbly done, the radio series was, I thought.
Yes, I loved working on the radio series.
I like it better than the television series, if I may say so.
No, we did the TV series largely because, and you may be astonished to hear this, I discovered that there were people out there who neither listened to the radio nor read books. And
they are
so this is
protoplasmic appendages of television.
Yeah, they're the sort of people going, and sort of watch the moving pictures. And we thought, well, they're out there, we may as well go and lure them in. And so that was really why we did the TV series. Also because, I wanted to get the thing launched in America, and the TV seemed to be the only possible way. But I didn't enjoy doing a TV series. The great thing about radio...
Did you write the radio scripts, by the way?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I wrote the whole thing. The radio show was, it's such an intimate medium, not only just for the readers, but for the people making it. You just get a small bunch of people who sort of sit in a studio and sort of work all hours until it's done. And there's a tremendous sort of commitment and invention, and people are sort of trying things out because time isn't too expensive.
Later on, we're going to hear a portion of one of Alan's plays done by Earplay, who did superb radio drama over American National Public Radio. Isn't that what they're called?
Yeah, Earplay. They were international too. They were on the BBC. They would lease the show to the BBC and Australia.
But I am convinced that you can do superb work in the form of tragic drama or comedy or whatever sort of theatrical invention in the form of radio plays.
Yeah,
and there was a time when I was a kid that there were wonderful radio plays on the American air. There still are on BBC, I think.
Yeah, well, the difference between radio and television, largely speaking, is that on radio the scenery is better. Do you know, a friend of mine who's a very eminent computer scientist named Dr. Alan Kay recently was doing a research project on American kids, just testing their reasoning power. And it was an exact duplicate of an experiment he'd done 15 years previously, and he was horrified at what had happened in the meantime. He said the reasoning power of American kids had just plummeted in that time. And he, as far as he was concerned, laid the blame squarely on the doorstep of television. And this terrifying statistic that the average American watches 7.5 hours of television a day. And he came up with this interesting calculation. I don't know what he bases his figures on, that the American television industry is worth in financial terms per year the cost of 2 B-1 bombers. And I believe he's written to his congressman to suggest that if the country were able to do without each year 2 B-1 bombers, the government could buy up the American television industry and abolish it, and thereby regain the natural resource of the intellect of its kids. And I, for one, would welcome that.
You know, Milt, you can have Howard Gelman and David Platt, the two guys who did Earplay, right on you there at the University of Wisconsin. You can have them on your show, and they will tell you what happened to Earplay and what happens to theater on radio. You just can't make no money at it. And why do that when you can do adult rock? Hey, adult rock. Yeah. And there's no reason to try to make theater when you can spin platters and have some full-cell Zitzcream.
Radio's a funny business. As I've learned, because I stumbled into it, and I've been an amateur at it now for almost 12 years, doing an almost nightly program.
I would much rather have a spirited amateur than a bored professional. And
there's a whole conversation there we could have, but then it doesn't quite fit the context of a program on the comedic impulse. Instead, we will go to some samples from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and here's where you, Doug Adams, ended the world. Well, it's wonderfully written, wonderfully acted, and full of superb conceits in the old meaning of the word.
Yes.
Superb confabulations. Where does all this come from? You're a young fellow of only, what, about 31 or 32 at the moment?
32. At the time, I mean...
There's such richness there.
It came largely from two things, one of which was poverty and the other was despair. But... And in fact, writing those narrator sequences was actually one of the most sort of valuable writing exercises from which I've learned an awful lot, because the narrator had to be there on the show, not because I'd originally conceived of having a narrator on the show, but only because on radio you have to have a narrator, because there are certain things that is just impossible.
Oh, it's very economical. It's the proper device for moving it all along.
That's right, because there are all sorts of things you just cannot put in the dialogue. So there had to be a narrator. So what was I going to do with him? I just didn't want him just baldly to be saying, and next this happened, and now this happened. So there had to be some kind of character constructed for him.
And he's got to be sort of a wry universal intelligence.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Well, that sort of emerged, and it emerged this way, that I would write what had to be there, and then would pepper it out with a sort of few extra sort of jokes and digressions. And we'll always end up then with really quite a long piece that you could not possibly put out on radio just like that, because you couldn't have somebody talking for that long, a sort of single voice. So you'd then start the business of compacting it. You'd have to edit down every single unnecessary word and shove it together like a concertina and compact it until words are sort of jostling up against each other in sort of slightly strange ways. And then you'd say, well, that sounds interesting that those two words go together now. And then you'd sort of rewrite it from there, and then you'd go through it again, and you compact it again and compact it till you ended up with something about, a sixth the length of the original piece, which had taken on a whole new tone and a whole new air, largely because of that business of squeezing it all together.
It's wonderful stuff, and Alan Gross does wonderful stuff of a different order. We're going to come to that right after some commercials. We may come back then, if we've got the time, to the Hitchhiker's Guide and get the answer from the grand computer, the answer to the question of what is it all about, Alfie? That isn't quite the way you ask it, but it's a question that haunts the first volume. At any rate, an excerpt from one of Alan Gross's plays, as done by Earplay, and we'll get on to that with some introduction before we listen to it, right after we pause for these messages.
Back now to Extension 720. Here with the final segment of tonight's show is your host, Milt Rosenberg.
And let's work in a few telephone calls. If you gentlemen will put on those headsets, 591-7200 is the number, 591-7200. You are on the air. Good evening.
Hello, my name's Frank, and I've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and seen the TV show, and it's great to talk to Doug Adams. The books and the TV show were just great to watch. And I'd like to ask on ensemble comedy and how British humor has affected American humor. It seems that with successful groups like Monty Python, Second City TV, the original Saturday Night Live, I think that some of the success depends on that the actors are the writers, as compared to, let's say, Bob Hope's humor, which is written by other writers, but it's not quite as funny. And I was wondering that how do you feel about actors being the writers?
Well, in all the great ensemble groups, apparently a good deal of the writing, if not all of it, is done by the actors themselves. That's true of Monty Python.
Python is... It's, as the credits at the end say, written, conceived, and performed.
But over on this side, it really has been true of Saturday Night Live, except they've got an extra group of writers.
They have an extra group of writers too, but they come from the improv world, and in the improv world, you write your own stuff and then refine it as time goes on.
Let's dash to another caller, working one or two more quickly. Good evening. You're on the air.
Hello, my name's Irene, and I'd like to say that I really liked your books a lot.
Oh, thank you.
And I was wondering, what really happened when the Earth was demolished?
Oh, that's why you should read the fourth...
I did read it, but I didn't really understand.
Oh, really?
Well, you should read it again. I was actually probably a little more obscure than perhaps I should have been at that point. But I don't want to embark on a long explanation of it now, so I suggest you read it again more carefully, and you'll see.
Okay.
Yes, and it being so long, and thanks for all the fish, in which the mysteries are resolved. We're going to work in one more call. We've got to do this rather quickly, I fear, but a relevant question, I think. Good evening, you're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Adams.
Hello.
I was wondering if there's going to be a fifth book in the trilogy, and if not, when we can expect it. I heard an interview you did with National Public Radio where you said that there wasn't going to be a fourth book, and you expected to have it out sometime in the spring, so... I will take...
No, well, I mean, the thing is, you obviously cannot have 5 books in a trilogy. I mean, that's just silly.
Well, four books in a trilogy doesn't work either, so...
Yes, but 4 is just an exaggeration of a trilogy. 5 is actually something you can't do. No, I'm very, very keen at the moment that I must go on and do new stuff, because, Hitchhiker's been fine, but it's got to the point where everybody else tells me what I want to do with it, and I'd love to...
That leads me to the great cliché question, and I'll try to avoid clichés, but in this case I am really interested. And what are you up to now?
Well, a number of things. the thing is, I want to write sometime within the next year, I want to write a completely new book, which will be where I get to be in charge again, because I feel with Hitchhiker a lot of other people are sort of get in charge, because everybody says, you know, I want you more of this, and let's have this character back, and let's do, and why haven't you done, and I would just love to do something where I'm back in charge again. So that'll be something new. And the other thing I've really become terribly interested in the last year is in computing. I've just done an interactive fiction version of part of the first book of a company called Infocom, where you get to play the part of Arthur and in fact several of the other characters as well. It's not for people who don't know about these things. I should explain that this is not the sort of computer game in which you have to sort of shoot down rocket ships or chase little aliens around mazes or anything like that. It's purely a text-based thing. It's the sort of radio end of computer games, it's remarkable for being, I think, the first software anybody knows of that actually deliberately lies to the user. I really had an immense amount of fun working on this program. So much so that I almost mistook it for not being work. The exciting thing actually I found about working in this field was that so little had been done. Just by the very chronology of it, you knew that everything you sat down to do was new. Nobody had done anything like this before. Partly because, I mean, so far, virtually everybody who's written stuff for the computer have been computer scientists or programmers rather than writers.
Andy Tobias, who's a writer on financial subjects and writes with great wit as well, has had great success, was here a while ago. I've known him for years, and he was full of similar enthusiasm for a project he's just completed, and it was a complex program for sort of home bookkeeping or getting your finances in order, but he thinks it's the most effective and thoroughgoing program of that sort, and he doesn't know anything about programming, but was working with some programming geniuses in New York who kind of took his ideas and translated them into algorithms. And
well, it's rather like what's happening now as other people now become involved with programming. It's rather like, you can imagine that there might have been a time when the typewriter was invented, when the only people who had actually worked on the typewriter and written stuff on it were the people who designed the typewriter.
Alan,
are you
moving from plays to programs yet?
No, I'm not. As a matter of fact, Sunday night, that's the night after tomorrow, Slight Ache is a Harold Pinter play that I'm directing that opens at the Gare St. Lazare at 858 Armitage. It's just 2 blocks west of Armitage and Halstead, and that's the Slight Ache. And then next Friday night, a play of mine called Morning Call that I wrote but did not direct. David Whitaker did a real nice job directing it up at the Tom Long Theater. That's in the Granada Theater building on Sheridan and Devon. So I'm busy running between those two projects.
We've got 1 or 2 more cuts that I'd love to play, and this next one is a gift not only to all of our audience but to Doug. I'm sure, Alan, that you've heard it, but quite possibly Doug hasn't. It goes back to the early days of Second City in Chicago. One of the great comic actors in, I guess, the first batch, even before I came to Chicago, Severin Darden. And this is his great philosopher routine. You know it, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Here it is.
He was just in town again.
Oh, really?
That's very funny.
You hadn't ever heard that, had you?
No. The joke I like best was about all the guys beginning with H.
Yes, it's a wonderfully.
That whole bunch.
That whole crowd.
Yes, that whole crowd, yes.
You say Darden was in town?
Well, the Second City had its 25th anniversary about 2 weeks ago, and he did a marvelous thing with Shelley Berman.
Really?
Yeah, and I thought he is very intellectual, very smart from that University of Chicago.
What set me looking in our file drawers for it this evening is that, because I was reminded of it just last night, I happened inadvertently in a conversation on this program last night with William McNeill, the great historian, to quote Heraclitus and that famous metaphor about time being like a river. And then that reminded me of the Severin Darden routine, and I knew I had it here someplace. So I spent half an hour pushing things aside and was happy to discover it behind a dusty file this very evening. We've got about 4 minutes left. A quick request for one more, and the people in the booth don't know what I'm after, but this is just a touch of Saturday Night Live. It's 18 on our list, and it's done by Garrett Morris. A very brief bit, and I think you may both know this one. I think it's utterly charming. all sorts of comedy bits tonight. And I persist with my heavy professorial interest in the basic question of what indeed is humor? What ties all this stuff together? What's going on in everything that we've heard?
Well, you want to... I still think that...
There's mockery, I suppose.
Humor is the outside looking in. And in America it becomes hard, as I say, because the inside is so big and democratic. The two funniest men in America today are black, Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor. A history of Jews. A history of ethnic comedians. People on the outside looking in. Once they get on the inside, they become Alan King. They become guys with tennis matches named after them. The funniest
so you're saying the key to humor is alienation or distance?
The outside, a point of view.
It's perspective, which very often will show you how two apparently completely unrelated things are in some crucial way actually the same. And you put them together and they go spark, and you suddenly see it as funny. No, that's the same. I mean, as you know, the alienation being outside.
The great English humorists are mostly Catholics, because that's the big outside group. Evelyn Waugh is the first one that shoots into mind, and many of and Pinter, a Jew, a very comic force, a dark vision too.
But the single greatest American comic of a sort these days, the one most close to the heart of all America, is Johnny Carson.
He's easiest to take for everyone.
From Nebraska.
You can do Johnny Carson the next day at the office. Hey, yeah! And everybody goes, hey, got it. Because he's easiest. He's most accessible. He's certainly not funniest. He's just most accessible.
I find David Letterman much funnier coming after it. No, actually, going back to what we were saying earlier.
He's a Hoosier from Indiana.
He's the yuppie version of Johnny Carson.
Well, it's like, Johnny Carson is the very, very slick, polished professional. David Letterman is still like the enthusiastic amateur.
A touch of awkwardness and
which makes it much
even.
funnier.
We are out of time. This has been a delightful session, and I'd like to go on and do it for another 2 hours. But nobody would hear it except the three of us.
Well, who cares? Let them come here.
Who cares? Let's, though, plug, as we end, Douglas Adams' new book, So Long, and Thanks for All the Fish, and Alan Gross's...
Gare St. Lazare, Sunday night, 858 Armitage. Be there or be square. No Levi's or Caprice, please.
And with that, we're out of time. Cordial thanks to my two guests, and thanks to all for listening. We'll be back again on Monday night with Alan Ryan, who prosecuted Nazi war criminals in this country for the Department of Justice, and is the author of the new book, Quiet Neighbors, about those people and about those prosecutions. Until then, thanks to all for listening.
This is Bill Cosby. If you're a bored teen